तुसे सारियां गी मेरी तरफों नमस्ते। आज अस इंटरनेशनल डोगरा सोसाइटी जुड़े दे हैं इतिहास के पन्ने कनेक्टिंग टू द रूट्स एंड टुडे आवर टॉपिक इज Seeds of Terrorism and Failure of Leadership Part 1. I would now hand over to Shri Harbans Singh Sambyal ji to take the session further.
Thank you, Lalit. Namaskar. We today enter into a very significant phase of our this series of lectures. And most of us are very keen to hear more about this. Before I begin with the actual terrorism, we have to understand the background of all this. The major players who influenced the events that led to terrorism. And among them, the most significant factor is Pakistan. So we need to understand two things about Pakistan. Pakistan, the state, and Pakistani army. I'll deal with both of them, not in a detailed manner, but just to give you an idea that what kind of mindset Pakistan, the state, and Pakistan's army had developed. Many historians, they accept the fact that Pakistan is a child whose parents were not sure whether they wanted the child or not. There were two parents. The spiritual father of Pakistan is said to be Allama Iqbal. And often the Pakistani sources, they quote his Allahabad address of 1930 to the Muslim League. But before we reach to the Allahabad session, a little bit of background to the events before that is educative. Indian National Congress was established in 1885. By 1928, it had progressed to such a stage that a bridge had already been built between the older generation and the new generation. And a committee was formed under the chairmanship of Motilal Nehru, representing the old generation, and included Subhash Chandra Bose and Jawaharlal Nehru, the second generation leaders. This committee was tasked with giving a roadmap for India that the Congress wanted to build after independence. And it's very surprising that in 1928, the vision that Subhash Chandra Bose and Nehru presented to the All India Congress committee was so progressive that when the Constitution of India was built, the Constitution by and large reflects those aspirations which had been noted down by the committee. That long back, the idea of a creche for working mothers had been penned down. So you can imagine what kind of progressive mindset both those young leaders possessed. Muslims woke up late to this awakening of new India. Muslims woke up by 1906 when All India Muslim League was established. It was established out of a fear of the majority. Till now, Muslims in India had been the ruler or the deposed rulers after the British had arrived, after 1857. But in their mind, they considered themselves as the rulers of India. But now with the Congress pushing for democracy, it was very obvious that their rule, even in the mind, will no longer be there. And this fear was expressed by one of the couplets of Allama Iqbal, in which he wrote, जमहूरियत एक तर्ज हुकूमत है कि जिसमें बंदों को गिना करते हैं तौला नहीं करते. What is republic? Republicanism is the counting of the heads, not evaluating the quality of the mind which is in that head. So this elitist attitude, dismissing democracy, was born out of the fear of the minorities of a majority rule. So this was formed. The Allahabad address, which I say is very important, and which most of the Pakistanis consider that to be the foundational myth of Pakistan. In that, what he said is one thing, and what was quoted is another. Even the Times of London that misquoted his address, and Allama Iqbal was constrained to write to the Times refuting that his speech had been quoted out of context. It is said that he made a call for a Muslim homeland. The fact is, what he said, I'll quote, the Muslim demand for the creation of a Muslim India within India is therefore perfectly justified. The resolution of the all parties Muslim conference at Delhi is, to my mind, wholly inspired by this noble ideal of harmonious whole, which instead of stifling the respective individualities of its components, affords them chances of fully working out the possibilities that may be latent in them. And I have no doubt that the House will emphatically endorse the Muslim demand embodied in this resolution. So he had not asked for a separate Muslim homeland. He had asked for a Muslim state, for a place of respect for the Muslims within India. Now, this was his belief. He personally believed, he went on to say, that he believed that Punjab, Northwest Frontier, Sindh, Baluchistan, they can be converted into a single state within India, where the Muslims can, being the majority. The fact is that in Sindh, they were in heavy majority. In Baluchistan, almost 99% Muslims. In Northwest, again, a heavy majority of the Muslims. And in Punjab, whether we like it or not, in undivided Punjab, the Muslims were in majority. So he believed that this is the area where the Muslims can enjoy the full freedom of their choice, and they can express their talent in the best possible manner. The second character of Pakistan, who is actually the father of Pakistan, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Aisha Jalal wrote a book a couple of years ago. The title of the book is The Sole Spokesman. And it traces Jinnah's life, his successes, and his failures. And she dissects the making of Pakistan or division of India in a very dispassionate manner, and blames the mullahs as well as the Congress leaders for leading to this divide. In 1940 was the first time the Muslim League was established in 1906. In 1940, for the first time, a call was given out for the creation of Pakistan. In 1940, a resolution was passed in which Jinnah declared that Hindus and Muslims are two separate entities. They have separate culture, separate beliefs, separate food habits. There's nothing common between the two. And it's not possible for them to live together. And therefore, a separate state should be created. The resolution which was passed by the Muslim League in 1940 Lahore session, again, it did not mention anything about a single state, single Muslim state. It again repeated states. Now, this argument, along with Muhammad Iqbal's call, the Bengalis of East Pakistan, they used that very argument to demand a separate state for themselves. That it was part of Allama Iqbal's call, and it was an agreed resolution which was passed in Lahore in 1940. So there should be two states. There should be states, number of states, Muslim states, where the Muslims can enjoy self-rule. This was the situation. The fact was that Muhammad Ali Jinnah, by that time, he had created so much of viciousness in politics that everybody believed that the only solution to this problem is division of the country, partition of the country. And finally, that took place. Now, the interesting thing is that when it did happen, when it was accepted that we part with one another, on 11th of August 1947, Muhammad Ali Jinnah addressed the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan in Karachi. And he gave a very significant, interesting call. It's very difficult to say whether it was an honest call or just a hypocritical address, because he did not live long to be proven either way. What he said, I'll read out the operative part. You are free to go to your temples, free to go to your mosques or any other places of worship in the state of Pakistan. You may belong to any religion or caste or creed that has nothing to do with the business of the state. You will find that in course of time, Hindus will cease to be Hindus and Muslims would cease to be Muslims. Not in the religious sense, because that is the personal faith of each individual, but in the political sense as citizens of Pakistan. This is Jinnah on 11th March 1947, before Pakistan came into existence, 5 days before that. And this is the vision he gave of a Pakistan, which apparently appeared that he had a very secular vision and not at all affected by the bigotry or the fanaticism which had been part of the politics of the 1940s. Now, why this happened and what happened after that, that too is a very interesting story. Nehru and Jinnah both regretted that they had been instrumental in partitioning the country. Pandit Nehru, according to Stanley Walport in his book about partition, he says that Pandit Nehru, within a year of the partition, he said, perhaps we acted wrongly. The consequences of that partition have been so terrible that one is inclined to think that anything else would have been preferable. Ultimately, I have no doubt that India and Pakistan will come together. Some kind of federal link. There is no other way to peace. The alternative is war. This was the opinion of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru a year after partition. What about Jinnah? Within a year, he was ill, he was dying, and on his deathbed, when Liaquat Ali visited him, he told him, Pakistan was the biggest blunder of my life. He also added in a whisper, if now I get an opportunity, I will go to Delhi and tell Jawaharlal to forget about the follies of the past and become friends again. There's another account when he was having an aerial view of the refugee camps. When he looked at the massive tentage in Punjab, he held his head and said, oh God, what have I done? This is according to one of his aides there. Indian High Commissioner in Pakistan, Shri Prakash, he told him, Prakash has written that in his book, tell Jawaharlal not to break my heart. You do not know how much I love Bombay. I still look forward to going back there. Now here is a man who had fought hard for creating a homeland for Muslims, now ready to abandon his new homeland and willing to come back to the city that he loved. So this was the kind of dilemma. But unfortunately, Jinnah didn't live long to have an impact on the creation of New Pakistan. And soon thereafter, the decision-making slipped into the hands of Liaquat Ali Khan and the mullahs. Now the first challenge was, India was already by that time finalizing the Constitution of India. And here was Pakistan still struggling. So much so that ultimately when it did, on 12th of March, the objective resolution of Pakistan was passed in the Constituent Assembly. 12th of March, 1949. By the end of 1949, India had finalized its constitution. In the month of May, we were struggling to bring Jammu and Kashmir into the constitution. That was the only problem left. Otherwise, by and large, the constitution was ready. Pakistan could only finalize their objective resolution. What are the objectives of the new country? On 12th March. The resolution read, sovereignty over the entire universe belongs to Allah Almighty alone, and the authority which He has delegated to the state of Pakistan through its people for being exercised within the limits prescribed by Him is a sacred trust. The state shall exercise its powers and authority through the chosen representatives of the people. The principles of democracy, freedom, equality, tolerance, and social justice, as enunciated by Islam, shall be fully observed. The Muslims shall be enabled to order their lives in the individual and collective spheres in accordance with the teachings and the requirements of Islam as set out in the Holy Quran and Sunnah. So this is the official objective resolution of Pakistan. The state will function according to the principles of Islam. The individual life will be governed by the Holy Quran and Sunnah, not by civil liberties, not by the constitution which formulates what are the rights, what are the duties, but what has been prescribed by the Holy Quran and by the Sunnah. So this was Pakistan when it came into being. Ali had allowed the mullahs not only a foot inside the door, but they had firmly entered the Constituent Assembly and plonked themselves in their seats. This, however, did not make Pakistan strong. In 1971, this philosophy was thoroughly exposed. When Bangladesh was created, that Pakistan cannot remain united just on the basis of religion, on Islam and its ideology. So when Zulfikar Ali Bhutto became the prime minister in 1973, he gave a new constitution to Pakistan. And according to this constitution, he officially brought Islam into the state. He went so far as to declare Ahmadiyas as non-Muslims. The consequences, I think all of us, we know that what kind of life the Ahmadiyas have to lead in Pakistan, a secret life almost. We blame Zia-ul-Haq for Islamization of Pakistan. But the fact is that this Islamization of Pakistan had begun under Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. Now, why did he do that? He was ostensibly a very secular person, very modern, very liberal. But in his mind, he was convinced that the unity of Pakistan can only be maintained by the use of Islam. So he put Islam as a central principle of Pakistani life. He, nevertheless, because of his misgovernance, he was finally overthrown by Zia-ul-Haq. And Zia-ul-Haq, he radicalized Pakistan further. He was the first authority in Pakistan who recreated the courts that were prevalent during the time of Prophet Muhammad. And the criminal justice system, instead of being modern, was replaced with the Hudud ordinances. That is, the criminal justice system would be the same which was prevalent during Hazrat Muhammad's time. That is, if somebody had stolen something, then his hand has to be publicly chopped off. If somebody is accused of adultery, then publicly that person has to be stoned to death. So that kind of punishment, that kind of Sharia courts, they were established by Zia-ul-Haq. Another thing, very interesting thing which happened during Zia-ul-Haq's time was that there was a cleric born in India, then he migrated to Pakistan, Maududi. He is the one who is credited with creating the Muslim Brotherhood, an international brotherhood, which is very powerful in Egypt and was for some years very influential in the whole Arabic world. And it was a challenge, particularly in Iraq as well as Syria. He had influenced Zia ul Haq a lot. So what he did was that he encouraged the followers of Maududi to influence the Pakistani army and the government employees. So his literature was freely distributed not only in the army but among the government employees also. The result was the whole of the society began to be slowly radicalized. The unfortunate and the ironical part was that Zia ul Haq had been appointed by Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. And during his trial, he said in the Supreme Court that I did not know that I had appointed a Tablighi as a chief of the army staff. So this is the kind of Pakistan that was developing. Now, what about the Pakistani army? As I said, that the other factor is the Pakistani army. Pakistan's army and India's army, they were cut from the same cloth. Same kind of training had been imparted to the officers of both the armies. And yet, the Indian army remained not only a political, but also secular. But Pakistani army, they veered to the other extreme. The reason was that soon they realized once the civilian authority began to invite army into the governance process. No, actually there have been only 2 coups in Pakistan, military coups. The first was by Zia ul Haq and the second was by Pervez Musharraf. Ayub Khan's coup was not a coup. He was invited by Iskandar Mirza, the president of Pakistan, to take charge. And he took charge and never left. Yahya Khan was ordered by Ayub Khan to take charge and he took charge. So of the 4 military dictators, 2 were genuine creators of the coup and the first two, they were not. They were invited by the civilian government. The only difference is that once the civilian government had invited army with Ayub Khan, they realized that the kind of job they do, they are so inefficient that we can do better than them. So we can create a better Pakistan than these people are doing. So they held on to power after that. And that has been ingrained in their minds ever since, that we can do a better political job also, without realizing that a number of times they have fallen flat. Particularly the partition of Pakistan, the secession of East Bengal is only to be attributed to the army of Pakistan, because for political reasons there can never be any military solution. It's as plain and as simple as that, which Pakistani army did not learn. So having said that, Pakistani army believes that it is the defender of not only the territory of Pakistan, but also the ideology of Pakistan. And what is the ideology of Pakistan? The ideology of Pakistan is Islam. And what is the aim? The aim is to make Kashmir a part of it. So two things are integral to Pakistani mind, whether that is political or military. That is Islam and Kashmir. So Pakistani army has taken upon itself the role of defending the ideology of Pakistan, though the fact is that there is no need to have an ideology for any country. The constitution is enough to run a country. But if there is any ideology, that has to be left to the political parties and not to the army. But that's what they decided, that's the course they chose. The insecurity which Pakistanis have felt was also felt by the army. And it's very interesting to note that General Gracie, the chief of the staff, he was the first person to, Douglas Gracie, the first person to formulate a comprehensive defense policy for Pakistan. In his mind, he visualized that Pakistan faces threats from both India and Afghanistan, particularly if India and Afghanistan, they decide to join hands. And if that happens, then Northwest Frontier Province, the Pashtuns, they too would rise against Pakistan. So in his mind, General Gracie, he formulated a policy which was to push the borders, the eastern borders, as far away from the strategic assets of Pakistan as possible. And that could not happen unless Kashmir was made a part of Pakistan. So that Indian borders, Indian forces are away from Peshawar and Rawalpindi. In the northwestern region, Afghanistan years, because they have stuck with the idea that Afghanistan has to be created as a client state. So in its efforts to make Afghanistan a client state, it has lost heavily, but it still continues to persist even today. Not for a moment has ever Pakistan shown any inclination that it can have friendly relations with India as well as Afghanistan. Let the Afghans be themselves. And let there be a settlement between India and Pakistan. Pakistan has been losing heavily. India, after so much of defense expenditure, modernizing its army, navy, and air force, it has still succeeded in keeping its expenditure on arms and defense below 3% of the GDP. That's a big achievement. Pakistan has not succeeded in doing that. And that is the reason it is in so much of economic crisis. So this being the situation of Pakistan, Pakistan having made Kashmir a central issue of its ideology and the need to have it, that there is no option for it but to go on struggling and losing till what time, God knows, probably till it comes to an end or it combusts itself. One of the two is going to happen. In 1965, it's very interesting that what kind of attitude they had developed. A Canadian High Commissioner, he asked President Ayub Khan, what does Pakistan want? He said that we want Kashmir, but we know that we cannot have it by force. If only you people had shown more guts, then we can have it, and after that we can live in peace. Now, this philosophy is not exclusive to President Ayub Khan. Even Jinnah had the same philosophy. Before he was diagnosed with his disease, and that it was almost the end, there's a famous photojournalist, Margaret Burke White. Those of us who have seen the movie Gandhi, Attenborough's Gandhi, will recall a Western lady who photographed Mahatma Gandhi at Aga Khan Palace when he was put there, detained there during the Quit India movement. She took many photographs of Mahatma spinning the charkha, going outside, walking, and Life magazine, they had produced all those photographs. She went to Pakistan and she met Jinnah and had a detailed conversation. And during the conversation, Jinnah defense and what the Pakistan gave to the world. In his opinion, the biggest asset which Pakistan has is its geopolitical positioning. It is located at such a place that he said that Western world needs Pakistan more. In other words, he was saying that you need to support us, because only then we will be in a position to give you access to this region to contain the thirst of the communism. So this kind of mindset is Pakistan. Now I'll come to another very interesting development of that period, which has directly impacted terrorism in India, or otherwise also. It has affected not only India, but the whole of the world. That is the year 1979. Rarely has history witnessed any year which has seen such earth-shaking events that have shaped the fortunes of the coming generations. Normally, it is believed that revolutions are born out of secular philosophies. Revolutions are born out of progressive thoughts. But here is a century in which revolutions took place, not a revolution, but revolutions took place, which were not the product of secular thinking, but of rightist thinking, of reactionary forces. First was the departure of Shah of Iran from Iran on 15th of January 1979. Shah of Iran is credited with making Iran a modern state, very rich, very modern. But it also had its underbelly. The underbelly was that it was a corrupt and oppressive regime. As anywhere else in the world, in Iran also, there were two other strains. One was the Marxist strain, and the other was the religious strain. And both of them, they were suppressed by Shah of Iran's forces. But gradually this has snowballed. Opposition to his regime had snowballed. And there used to be demonstrations, the kind of which the world had not seen on the streets. The end result was that he decided to flee. On 15th of January, he fled. On 1st of February, Ayatollah Khomeini returned. The revolution was inspired by Ayatollah Khomeini. The protests were organized by his followers. And the world saw a new kind of regime taking place. A religious, fanatically religious regime controlling Iran, a very rich country, oil rich. The world needed oil and Iran possessed it. So this went into the hands of the Islamists. Then an event had taken place in October 1978 in Vatican, which had a direct bearing on the events of 1979. Pope John Paul II had been elected as the new Pope in October 78. The significance was that he belonged to Poland, a communist country. After almost 5 centuries, for the first time, the electors had chosen a non-Italian Pope. And that too, somebody who had risen from among the communists. In June 79, for the first time after becoming a Pope, he visited his homeland, Poland. And a new wave began in the communist world, a wave of Christian moral regeneration. It was not a rebellion in the traditional sense, but they used the power of religion, the spiritual power, to rebel against communism. This marked the beginning of resistance to communism in the Eastern Bloc. The same year, a month earlier in May, in England, Margaret Thatcher was elected the Prime Minister. Now she unleashed a new kind of economics which the world had not seen, known as the market economy. And the world changed because soon this was to spread all over the world. The same summer, another significant event took place in the East. Mao Zedong died, And his successor, an old man in his mid-70s, Deng, he became the party boss. And he gradually began to dismantle the institutions that had been built by Mao. The cooperative farm structure, which had evidently failed, again returned back to the family farming. This family farming that again increased production, and China, the rural economy was back on the rails. The next big step which he took was he created special economic zones and encouraged small entrepreneurs to establish their units in that zone where a number of facilities were offered, and foreign exchange, foreign investment was also invited. That unleashed a new force in China, and the rise of China as an economic power which was to soon challenge America. This is the year these four events were significant, but the year was still not over. On the Christmas Eve of 1979, the Soviet tanks rolled into Afghanistan. And with their arrival, the kind of change which Afghanistan witnessed had not been seen by anyone. It was known that many invaders have met their Waterloo in Afghanistan. The Britishers had had a very tough time in Afghanistan. And finally, they also had decided to stay on one side of the Durand so that there is no clash with Afghanistan. Now what happened was, with this Soviet invasion, a new power had been unleashed. The Islamic Revolution, which had begun in January 1979, had taken roots. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting another significant event which is even of more greater significance. That is, in October of the same year, on the first day of Muharram, it was a new year, a new century rather, according to the Islamic calendar, the Hijri calendar, 1500 year, 1500 year was to begin. That day, when the first call, the first azan was made out for the faithful to come and pray in Makkah, it was taken over by armed men. Armed men belonged to Juhayman al-Utbi, a hardcore Islamist who did not believe in the state and who believed that Quran had written that a day before the day of judgment, a Mahdi will arrive. He will vanquish all the non-believers, purge the world of all non-believers, establish the law of Allah as told to mankind by Prophet Muhammad, and then the day of judgment would arrive. So he came to Makkah and he declared that the day of judgment is about to arrive. And the Mahdi has also arrived here. And soon the whole world will be vanished. And one of the targets was the House of Saud, the royal family of Saudi Arabia. Now, Saudi Arabia was in a fix now. What does it do? Islam forbids the use of violence within the house of God. So it called a conference of its leaders and religious leaders and asked the religious leaders to issue a fatwa. Fatwa is not an order which is binding, but which unbinds. So what is the order? The order is that there should be no violence in the house of God. So the royal family asked that we should be unbound by this order through a fatwa so that we can use violence in Makkah and free the Kaaba. They agreed, but on the condition that Saudi Arabia would use its petrodollars to spread the Wahhabi Islam, and that it will banish women from television, that co-education will not take place, that female teachers cannot teach boys, etc., etc. So in other words, in return for giving them fatwa for the use of violence in Kaaba, they demanded that their philosophy should be adopted by the royal family and it should spread the same message everywhere in the world. This is significant because the violence was used. Saudi Arabian police failed. Then they sought the help of French. The French commandos came and they executed the whole operation. Ultimately, in November, the next month, about 62 of the Juhayman followers, they were publicly beheaded, many more jailed, and numerous others banished from Saudi Arabia. But by this time, the followers of Juhayman had already spread all over the world, including India, including Kashmir, including Pakistan and Afghanistan. And I said that Muslim Brotherhood was already established in the Arabian world. All these people, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, volunteers from all these countries, they reached Afghanistan. And since USA found an opportunity to put Soviet Union in trouble, they supported their effort. And how could they support? They couldn't do it directly because these hardcore Islamists, they wouldn't take direct help from America. Zia al-Haq, he found this opportunity. And using that opportunity, he got all the funding from USA, funneled it towards jihad in Afghanistan, and also in radicalizing the Pakistani society as a whole and the neighboring country wherever it was possible. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is the background to the events that were to come. All these events, they converged. They converged where the situation was conducive. The only thing left was the Indian state capable of dealing with this challenge? Primarily, this ought to have been treated as a political challenge by the Indian government, that it does not create a situation where Pakistan can have a foot into the door. But the end result was, which I'll deal the next time, that the combination of failure of both the central government as well as the state government led to a situation where Pakistan had a field day. How that happened and what were the consequences, we'll deal next time. Thank you very much. Lalit, over to you.
Thank you so much for another informative session, Harbans. And this is of prime importance for us who are living in today's world to know why and what happened in our state or now UT, and to understand. And I suppose many of us would learn from this and see what is coming in the future years. So now I would like to open the forum to everybody listening. If there is any questions, this is the time to ask Harbans. I think today's session was quite self-explanatory. I don't see any questions coming now. So we would like to thank everybody for attending the session today, and we'll see you back. Next weekend is Christmas, so not next weekend, but the following weekend, we'll take the part 2 on the same topic. Thank you. Namaste.
Namaskar.